Now that we've seen the mechanisms of oxygen transport, we will explore mechanisms of CO2 transport in the blood. There are three mechanisms that transport CO2 within the bloodstream. Approximately 5% of CO2 produced by the tissues is dissolved in the plasma. Approximately 20% of the CO2 that is produced is bound to hemoglobin, and the majority of it, at approximately 70%, is converted into bicarbonate and transported that way. We'll primarily focus on the binding of CO2 to hemoglobin and the conversion of CO2 into bicarbonate. So first we'll examine the exchange of both oxygen and carbon dioxide at the tissues. Starting with oxygen, we see that most of the oxygen in our blood is carried by hemoglobin, and hemoglobin therefore represents the largest source of oxygen. At the tissues, we see that the tissue cells are metabolizing glucose into carbon dioxide. The carbon dioxide that is created dissolves into the tissue fluid and into the plasma. This high concentration of CO2 serves to weaken the oxygen-hemoglobin bond, and oxygen is released from hemoglobin. It diffuses out of the blood, down its concentration gradient, and enters the tissues. So meanwhile, the CO2 that is created enters the red blood cell and is converted by an enzyme called carbonic anhydrase into bicarbonate ions, which is HCO3. Bicarbonate then moves out of the red blood cell and into the bloodstream. Approximately 70% of the carbon dioxide picked up is converted into bicarbonate, and approximately 20% of the carbon dioxide that's created is loaded onto hemoglobin, creating a compound called carbaminohemoglobin. The CO2 that is loaded onto hemoglobin binds to hemoglobin at a site other than the iron atom of the heme group. So this means that CO2 is not competing for the same binding site as oxygen is. It is easier, however, for CO2 to bind to hemoglobin that has relatively few oxygens loaded onto it. So in this diagram and the next few diagrams, the thickness of the arrows indicates the quantity or the abundance. So the thicker the arrow, the greater the abundance of a particular gas from that source. So at the lungs, we see that the opposite is occurring that we saw at the tissues. So oxygen is diffusing down its concentration gradient, crosses the respiratory membrane between the air in the alveoli and the red blood cells in the bloodstream, and enters the blood plasma. So here it is very quickly picked up by the red blood cells and loaded onto the heme groups of hemoglobin. Bicarbonate, on the other hand, is converted back into carbon dioxide and released into the alveoli. Or we see that the CO2 that is being carried by hemoglobin is released. So when hemoglobin releases the carbon dioxide it is carrying, that changes the shape of hemoglobin, making it easier for oxygen to bind to the heme groups. So the fact that CO2 more easily binds to hemoglobin when the partial pressure of oxygen is low is a phenomenon called the Haldane effect. The Haldane effect promotes the pickup of CO2 at the tissues, as the partial pressure of oxygen tends to be low at the tissues because the tissues are using oxygen in its metabolic processes. The Haldane effect also explains why hemoglobin more easily promotes the release of CO2 at the lungs because there is a higher partial pressure of oxygen at the lungs. The bicarbonate tends to build up in the erythrocytes. So we see that there is a greater concentration of bicarbonate in the erythrocytes than there is in the surrounding blood plasma. And as a result, some of that bicarbonate will leave the erythrocytes and move down its concentration gradient into the plasma in exchange for chloride ions. This phenomenon is referred to as the chloride shift and occurs because by exchanging one negative ion for another negative ion, neither the electrical charge of the erythrocytes nor that of the bloodstream is altered. So in this way, it's keeping the blood chemistry the same.